They call him the stupidest man in history. Pete Best, the drummer who quit the Beatles, just as they were on the brink of fame, fortune, and worldwide success. But exactly why did Best leave the band in a flurry of violence and confusion? And why did Dracula, the legendary vampire prince of Transylvania, climb out of his crypt to chase the Beatles around the globe until they were forced to withdraw from the public eye in a veil of secrecy and shame? Shocking new evidence shows the sad story of lost Beatle Pete Best may not be what it seems. Yellow Submarine, When I'm 64, and Octopus's Garden. Just three of the most popular songs by the Beatles, a 1960s rock and roll band from the UK that's considered by some music scholars to have been one of the most popular teen dance bands of their era. Even today, many oldies aficionados enjoy listening to the trebly twang of John, Paul, George, and Ringo, the four lads from Liverpool. But what about their original lineup, the one featuring dreamy drummer Pete Best?
At that time also that they weren't going to go as big as what they are now.
He figured this was an active new future, and so he might as well pull out and start an act of his own.
Best originally joined the Beatles in 1960, just as they were headed to Hamburg, Germany for a long string of performances at the legendary Top 10 Club. Best's expert musicianship and movie star good looks quickly overshadowed the rest of the band. As jealousy turned to rage, John, Paul, and George decided to sack the spotlight-stealing drummer ASAP. Of course, the effete, foppish Beatles couldn't bear to confront Best directly, so they turned to their manager, the notoriously sadistic and violent Brian Epstein, a man known around the London music scene for wearing a necklace made from the severed ear of pop star Billy Fury. Recently uncovered documents show that Epstein lured the unsuspecting Best into a remote Bavarian forest under the guise of having a set of rototoms to add to his drum kit. But there were no rototoms, and before Best knew what happened, Epstein bashed him in the skull with a shovel and quickly buried him alive. On the way back to Hamburg, Epstein picked up Pete Best too, a dead ringer for Best in terms of looks and drum skills, but without any of the real Pete Best's charm, wit, or intelligence. Although briefly re-energized by the addition of the new, dumber Pete Best, the remaining Beatles quickly tired of his poor personal hygiene and sloppy caveman-sized body. Once again, manager Brian Epstein tapped into his sadistic side, and the replacement Best was soon disposed of. This time, the band brought in Ringo Starr as their drummer, and the classic Beatles lineup was finally in place. Meanwhile, back in the Transylvanian forest, the original Pete Best wasn't quite as dead as the Beatles thought. Apparently, Best was only bruised and managed to climb out of the shallow grave and seek help at a nearby castle. What Best didn't know was that the castle's owner was the legendary Count Dracula, vampire prince of Transylvania. At first, the Count could barely believe his luck at having a victim delivered directly to his doorstep.
I am Dracula. I bid you welcome. Listen to them. children of the night. What music they make.
I didn't know but that you might be hungry.
Dracula found himself deeply moved by Best's tale of rock and roll injustice and vowed to help Best rebuild his career. Later that night, Pete Best made a Faustian bargain with the Count. The next day, Dracula arose from his coffin promptly at sundown, eager to get started on his new career as a rock and roll impresario, and determined to mold the newly vampiric Pete Best into an international star. In doing so, Dracula would not only fulfill his secret, centuries-old dream of getting into showbiz, but he would also get access to the necks of all the frantic female fans that his rock star protege would surely attract. Armed with lyrics the Count had been toying with for decades, they went straight into Dracula's home studio and cut the horror rock classic Transfusion in a single stunning take.
Tooling down the highway doing 79. I'm a twin pipe papa and I'm feeling fine. Hey man, dig that. Was that a red stop sign? Transfusion. I'm just a solid mess of contusions.
Next, Dracula arranged a makeover for his client, transforming Best from a burned-out former Beatle into Nervous Norvis, the world's first vampire rock star. Released in October of 1963, Transfusion tore to the top of the charts, only to be replaced in early November by Pilgrim Paul's Thanksgiving-themed novelty hit, I Did the Monkey with a Turkey, and It Made a Chicken Out of Me. By this point, Pete Best was ready to give up on the music biz, but as his manager, Count Dracula had one last plan. Kidnap the Beatles and force them to write and record a hit song with Pete Best. Since Dracula had severe IBS and couldn't be away from his castle for very long, it fell to Pete to chase down and kidnap the band. But after an embarrassing, failed attempt made the tabloids, it was clear that Dracula himself needed to diaper up and go after the mob tops in person. Donning his Depends, Dracula tracked the Beatles to the United States, where they would soon be wrapping up their second tour of the country at the fabled Cow Palace near San Francisco.
Here are the Beatles!
Having carefully mapped out his kidnapping scheme, the Count knew he would need an irresistible honeypot to lure in his prey, something far more desirable to a quartet of hairy, half-witted Englishmen than a mere sexpot. So it was at great personal expense that Dracula purchased and began renovations on a down-at-the-heels watering hole on San Francisco's Skid Row. With the Beatles' final show coming up in less than 2 weeks, there was little time to spare. The Count hoped to tempt the touring Beatles into stopping in for a drink and never leaving. But Dracula's demanding devotion to detail threatened to derail everything, as he fired one contractor after another for being too un-British. Construction costs spiraled into the then unheard-of millions of dollars, attracting unwanted attention from the local media. Despite all this, the bar was finally transformed into an authentic British pub, seemingly certain to attract any thirsty Englishman in the area. When the Beatles finally did turn up at the pub shortly after their final concert of the tour, the Count's kidnapping scheme seemed to be shaping up perfectly, until a trap door installed in the bar's floor only opened wide enough to capture one Beatle, ironically Ringo Starr, who had replaced Pete Best all those years ago. Realizing that kidnapping just one Beatle was a dangerous mistake, the Count quickly shape-shifted into bat form and flew home to Transylvania.
Back in his castle, the Count promptly fired Pete Best as his client and then retired from the music industry altogether, opting instead to focus his attention on his growing collection of HO scale model trains. Although disappointed, Pete Best didn't give up. Moving to the United States, Best grew out his hair, changed his name, and finally found his place in the spotlight as Ray J. Johnson, a beloved comedian and commercial actor.
My name is Raymond J. Johnson Jr. Now you can call me Ray, or you can call me Jay, or you can call me Johnny, or you can call me Sonny,
Or you can call me Johnny, or you can call me Ray J, or you can call me RJ, or you can call me RJJ, or you can call me RJJ Jr. Or you can call me Johnson.
As for the Beatles, the strain of the kidnapping attempt proved too much for the band, and it wasn't long before they imploded in a haze of LSD and marijuana before being largely forgotten by an indifferent public tired of sappy treacle and navel gazing.
Boring.
Showbiz, you know how it is.